Taxonomy, bread and circuses. We ended the last talk on ontologies talking about what it was, and I was talking about what it was we were trying to do with, quote, ontology. And, I gave a quick definition that an ontology is a specification of a conceptualization. So, specification, specs. It's the specs. It's how you are providing an understanding of what this conceptualization is. OWL is specifically geared towards providing that kind of specification for computer programs, software agents, as opposed to people. Although XML, part of the idea of XML and other types of markup language is that they can be somewhat human readable. So our modest goal is, if you just take a look at the existing thesaurus standard, Z39.19 table 1 from the ANSI NISO Z39.19, and you get to that at their site, the whole standard. I encourage you to get it in PDF or whatever format and download it, because that's your guide to how to do this. Defines certain kinds of relationships. On the left-hand column, equivalency, hierarchical, and associative. Thesaurus Master has all three of those. Now, hierarchical, associative, and equivalence. What we want to try to accomplish, and part of this is, again, handling the directionality and where you store this. Do we store it separately in the term record? And then part of it is a question of display, how you display it. And that's also part of the issue of multilingual. It's not so much that Thesaurus Master can handle multilingual. It is how do you display it in different views, because it's UTF-8 Unicode, so you can type in, cut and paste any kind of character set, put it in there, or type it in if you have the keyboard drivers. But, how do you really display it and how do you want to do the equivalence between languages? And even more difficult, there's one thing to say bureaucracy is the same as equivalent to bureaucracy in English and American English, English, and French. They're equivalent. It's another thing to handle related terms. That's a little harder. So we handle equivalence, hierarchical, and associative. What we can add in terms of going towards, quote, an ontology or ontology master is to be able to add additional attributes or specifications of those relationships. So under equivalence, they give you, and this is not an exhaustive list per se, but it's giving you some examples. You have one type of equivalency is a synonym. Another type is a lexical variant. A third type that they show there is a near synonym. And they give examples in the right-hand column. Smoothness, roughness. They're not the same, but there's a certain nearness in terms, they call those near synonyms. Hierarchical, you have generic, or that's your ISA, and then instance, like sea, Mediterranean Sea. Instances are where you get into conceptual terms, and inside your thesaurus, in your hierarchy, you have actual, let's say, product names. That would be an instance relationship, is a kind of relationship. Whole part, which is the only one I can usually remember off this chart, off the top of my head when we're talking about, is whole part. Brain, stem. Under associative, it gets a lot longer list, and so there can be a lot more types of relationships. Action product, action property, action target, such as teaching student. But then you have to say, okay, the relationship between teaching and student. Teaching is an action, student is the target. So you need to capture that relationship and make sure you capture the directionality. So if you're looking at the term record for student, you know what the relationship is to teaching. And if you're looking at the term record for teaching, and there's a link or associative link to student, you know what the relationship is in the direction. Because it may be obvious if you're looking at brain, and narrow term is brain stem, so you know it's hierarchical. And then you add whole part, so you know that enriches your understanding. But if you're looking at just the term brainstem, or looking at just the term brain in isolation, you need to show that directionality. So that's kind of the challenge, because if you have brain and then you enter a new term, narrow term brainstem, and you say it's a part of brain, then brain has to say it's the whole. But that's the kind of thing we're trying to drive at with an ontology master. The downside, really, as Margie said, there are the number of instances out there of an ontology aren't real common. The problem is it gets out of hand very quickly, because these are just suggestions. Action product, action property, well, you can go on. I mean, how many is's member of? I mean, the variation, because you have just as much problem with ambiguity with your descriptor as you do with the terms themselves. So labeling the relationship is just as tricky and just as variable as it is picking your terms that you put in your thesaurus. And then you say, well, I'm going to call it whole part. Well, I'm going to use a different word for whole, and I'm going to use a different term for part. I'm going to use a different term for action and target. So those terms, and it's sort of endless. And triple stores, one of the challenges triple stores is they tend to end up in the millions real quickly. You've got millions of them. That is the problem you run into with sort of ontologies run amok. Is you have to. The purpose of a thesaurus is to control your vocabulary. Primarily, we're dealing with conceptual or subject term, but also proper nouns. I mean, like geographic names, is to control them and name variants. You got to do the same thing with your descriptor that describes the relationship between the two items. The third part of a triple store. Yeah, that has to be controlled as well, and managed and kept very tightly controlled. The reason I went through and and I'm not trying to do the wrap up per se, but going through there is to give us a sense of thinking over what you've heard in the last 3 days. Why are taxonomies hot? That was taxonomies, thesauri was kind of and the use of them was kind of the link through the whole 3 days so far, and the special training for the next 2 days will emphasize those some more. So why are these things really important? And the case studies and the way people are using them, I hope, made that fairly obvious. But we can, exchange some ideas of why you think taxonomies are hot, why they're needed, what problems do they solve, and I should have put in the negative of that, and what can't they do? Because they're not the answer to every search problem or every descriptive problem out there. They're part of the solution. And what opportunities do they open up for you to be going down this road of semantic enrichment? In my presentation on Monday, I had a list of like 16 ways of, wasn't quite as long as the book that was published in the 70s, 101 uses for a dead cat. And I'm a cat, but I love cats, but look that up on Amazon. It might still be out there. But 16 uses and of a thesaurus. So at this point, do you have some ideas, some overwhelming issues that on these sorts of questions, like why am I doing this? Where am I going with this? Why is it? And why did I call it bread and circuses? Well, because there are a lot of myths and misunderstandings about a thesaurus, and that one of the reasons I kind of lingered on ontologies was, some people think a thesaurus is an ontology, and it's not. An ontology is a way you can use an ontology to describe a thesaurus, particularly using the web ontology language, or SCOS. Why did SCOS come out? Because the web ontology language does not define any element names. SCOS does. So that gives you a standard that a software agent can write against. Because if you're using your own descriptive terms, your own elements, the ones SCOS specifically defines the element names. Now you can extend that as well. You can add additional elements. But if you're using a SCOS, the equivalent of SCOS element, you should use the actual label that SCOS defines. That allows the software agent some degree of reliability in going in there and interpreting what is meant by that element. And one of the slides I think Margie showed was a lot of top-end things. She said, oh, well, there's a lot of stuff in it. Well, those were the resolvers. That tells the software agent where to go to interpret the DTD or schema. It gave a URL. So you go back, and it's a kind of a loop through. You go back and say, well, what does this mean? Because you can go back to where that standard is stored. But why are you doing this? For the benefit of what? And in looking at use cases, you begin to understand that and how other people are using it. If you do go down, for example, you get sucked into the ontology triple stores and things like that too early on, that could be an endless hole. My advice is, if there's some pressure, from higher up to do an ontology, is to build a solid thesaurus first, and then make that available to the people that are making these decisions. I want you to go out and do an ontology. First, do a thesaurus, do it well, and then make it available for them to review and start using. Start at that point first because then you'll have a solid foundation before you start going down there. But what happens all too often, if you start doing, let's say, a card sort exercise with the idea of going to an ontology, you'll never get there. It won't happen. If you start moving towards a thesaurus, and when we come out with Ontology Master, then you can add an additional attribute that better defines the relationship between two terms. That's what we're trying to accomplish with Ontology Master. So, but that pick list, and that's one way to do it, is you add a term, there's a pick list about the relationship. Manage that, keep it small. It has to be managed just like you manage the terms you're putting in there. Synonyms, preferred terms, non-preferred terms, related, all those things. do a strategic analysis, a plan of looking at why you need this, where it's going to go, how much you're willing to invest before you get too far down the road. Do you have the tools? Well, I mean, most of you do now because you have data harmony tools. And what a lot of people actually, and your folks a little farther along there, but a lot of folks don't really consider what they're going to do with the thesaurus afterwards, or their taxonomy. And this is a difficult thing to describe when you're in a sales situation, and you show the end result. You're doing like at PLOS or at Media Sleuth that we've showed you, and you click down and there's the you have to do the indexing. The thesaurus terms have to have been assigned to that content before you can do that kind of navigation. I know it's a simple concept, but it's missed by a lot of folks. Another thing that's very important in terms of myths and misunderstanding is that there are a lot of software tools that do auto categorization dynamically. They do it on the fly. They do clustering. And those have their role, they have their purpose, they have their uses. And they can be very, very helpful. But not for doing something like semantic fingerprinting, semantic analysis, or profiling. Because what a lot of these tools are doing when they dynamically do a cluster and show some sense of some top terms or topical terms, and the content is there, as soon as you add new content, it recalculates all the vectors and all the relationships. They're getting better at that. It used to be so computationally intense. Again, if you if you got beyond 10,000 items and you added 10,001, it kind of broke down. They're getting better at doing this reindex, but they have to recalculate. So the top terms change. Well, you can't do profiling that way. And how are you going to know what kind of content you have if you're a product manager developing new products, and you want to find out what resources you have out there, and you start doing a search, and it generates them dynamically. And the next time you go, it generates, and it's a different set. So you're going, well, what do I have out there? And a lot of them, when they do this dynamic cluster, they can do it pretty well, but they're putting it in what's equivalent to file folders, like SharePoint kind of a thing. So you've got file folders that are hierarchical and look like a taxonomy, and maybe even they've imported a taxonomy structure to create those file folders. But again, if you move that content somewhere else to try to create new products or do some analysis, peer review management, you lose that intellectual value add in some of those systems. So you have to be careful about what they mean by indexing, and how you're actually relating the taxonomy to your content. And are you making those taxonomy terms that you work so hard to develop, that thesaurus, are you making them a permanent part of your record? Taxonomy is only as useful, as it says there, as labeling or indexing your content. And that's its key function. Or labeling your digital resources, which might be an author. The abstract representation of a person, meaning the author record, by analyzing the things that they write. With the total cost of ownership for the level of precision you need, and most of you folks here are in scholarly publishers or doing, I have an audience of professional knowledge workers. The level of accuracy, precision, and persistence that you need is best done using a controlled vocabulary and then doing an indexing thing. The fastest way to get up and running is a rule-based approach. We made a call on a customer last week in Washington, D.C., that had the more automated, what they call more automated, the mathematical linguistic approach. They had a 2,200 term thesaurus that we built. So the guy, one of the techie guys, tried to play with it a little. He had to find 20 articles, and he picked a couple of terms. And it was very hard for him to find 20 articles for each term. So he had to find 40 articles that were unique enough to train the system. Now, he's got only 2,198 terms to go. So he's got to find 20 fairly unique articles for the rest of those terms. So you get down and you train it, and finding that can take longer than writing the rules, by the way. I mean, our experience has been like on an order of 5 or 10 to 1 in terms of time it takes to do that. So you run it through, you do the indexing, you don't like the results, what was wrong, you have no clue what was wrong with the items you selected for each node. Now, some systems don't require you to make those selections. They create the nodes for you. They create the topic nodes for you, and by mapping and with like co-occurrence. And again, that can be quick, and it can provide some very interesting results for you. But those topic nodes do not constitute a thesaurus. No way. You can take those as candidate terms. That can help speed things up. That's one way to get a bucket of terms to work with, as well as looking at search logs and looking at the glossaries and other things that are available to you.